through proximity, through relation. Perception can become stronger than documentation. Sociologists describe something called social closure. It refers to the process by which certain groups create barriers, not necessarily written rules, but invisible filters, private clubs, exclusive gatherings, elite academic institutions, high-level financial events. These environments are not inherently illegal. They are ecosystems of influence. But ecosystems create internal cultures. And in highly concentrated power environments, a psychological phenomenon can emerge: normalization. When individuals operate within closed circles for extended periods, moral confrontation can decrease, not necessarily because everyone shares malicious intent, but because validation becomes internal. When everyone in the room is influential, external criticism feels distant. This dynamic has appeared repeatedly throughout history, from aristocratic courts to corporate boardrooms. It is not unique to one case. It is a structural pattern. One of the most controversial aspects surrounding Epstein was the perception of differential treatment during earlier legal proceedings. Regardless of legal technicalities, public reactions centered on fairness. Institutions survive on trust. When people believe that the system treats citizens differently based on status, confidence erodes. And confidence is the invisible pillar of democratic systems. Without it, even lawful decisions feel suspect. The damage, therefore, is not only legal, it is symbolic. Because once the public perceives inequality before the law, every subsequent event is interpreted through that lens. Then came the death, officially ruled a suicide, but accompanied by administrative failures that fuel public skepticism. Here, it is crucial to distinguish two things. Questioning is not the same as conspiracy. In any high-profile case involving powerful individuals, procedural errors will amplify suspicion. When protocols fail in sensitive situations, trust suffers, even if no larger plot exists. And in the era of hyperconnectivity, information gaps are filled rapidly, often emotionally, often dramatically. The human brain dislikes uncertainty. When there are unanswered questions, it constructs narratives to resolve discomfort. We live in what could be called the age of hypertransparency. Never before has so much information been accessible. Documents, court records, news reports, digital archives, and yet, paradoxically, never before has there been so much suspicion of hidden truths. Information overload does not equal clarity. Fragmented data travels faster than contextual explanation. A headline can shape perception before a full legal document is read. A photograph can ignite speculation without timeline analysis. And in that environment, possibility is often confused with probability. Yes, many things are possible in complex systems, but possibility does not automatically imply likelihood. This distinction is frequently lost in online discourse. Throughout history, moments of scandal involving elites have followed similar patterns. Revelation, public outrage, investigation, media saturation, attention shift. The digital age accelerates this cycle. Outrage has a short half-life. The next crisis competes for attention, and when cases feel unresolved, they linger as cultural ghosts. Epstein has become one of those ghosts. Not just a person, but a metaphor for perceived elite insulation, for unanswered questions, for the fragility of institutional credibility. Symbols endure longer than court proceedings. There is also a psychological component that must be examined carefully. Power alters perception. Numerous studies in behavioral psychology suggest that prolonged exposure to authority can reduce perceived risk, not because all powerful individuals become unethical, but because repeated immunity from consequence recalibrates internal boundaries. If someone operates for years without serious challenge, their sense of constraint may shift. This is a human tendency, not a moral verdict. Power environments amplify it. Closed networks amplify it further. Add prestige, wealth, and validation, and accountability becomes abstract rather than immediate. Again, this is structural psychology, not accusation. Another essential dimension is the role of media. Investigative journalism played a major role in bringing renewed attention to the case. But media also operates within commercial incentives. Stories that evoke emotion generate engagement. Engagement drives visibility. Visibility drives revenue. Complex bureaucratic explanations are less captivating than dramatic narratives. And so, sometimes the emotional framing outpaces the evidentiary pacing. This does not invalidate reporting, but it shapes public perception. A critical philosophical question emerges. Are systemic failures a result of corrupt individuals or systems that enable moral blind spots? The answer is rarely binary. Systems create incentives. Individuals act within those incentives. Blaming only the individual simplifies reality. Blaming only the system removes responsibility. A mature analysis holds both levels simultaneously. Conspiracy theories often thrive where trust is weak. They are not merely about hidden plots. They are about perceived exclusion. When people believe decisions are made far above them, behind opaque structures, every irregularity becomes magnified. The Epstein case did not create global distrust. It entered an already fragile environment. Polarization, economic inequality, digital misinformation, these forces were already eroding institutional confidence. The case became a lightning rod. Perhaps the most intellectually honest statement is this: we do not know everything. There are official findings. There are public records. There are legal documents. And there are limits. Complex systems rarely produce total transparency. Confidentiality in certain operations is functional in governments, corporations, and courts. But when confidentiality overlaps with public anxiety, distinction becomes blurred, and blurred lines breed suspicion. History offers perspective. Late-stage empires often experience growing distance between elite circles and the broader population. When that distance becomes too symbolic, trust fractures. The French aristocracy did not collapse solely because of individual wrongdoing. It collapsed because perception of inequality hardened into cultural conviction. The Roman elite did not fall overnight. It eroded through gradual disconnection. This does not mean modern systems are repeating identical patterns, but structural parallels are worth observing. In today's world, technology changes equation. Digital records, artificial intelligence, data analysis, whistleblower platforms. Exposure is easier than ever, but narrative manipulation is also easier than ever. Selective leaks, edited clips, algorithmic amplification. The same tools that promote transparency can distort reality. Power adapts. It always has. Ultimately, the enduring relevance of the Epstein case lies not in specific allegations alone. It lies in the underlying question: how do democratic societies ensure that proximity to influence does not become perceived immunity? That question transcends one individual. It challenges the architecture of modern governance. It challenges cultural attitudes towards status. It challenges how institutions communicate during crises. And perhaps most importantly, it challenges how citizens process uncertainty. We stand at a crossroads between healthy skepticism and corrosive cynicism. Skepticism asks for evidence. Cynicism assumes corruption as default. Societies need skepticism, but when cynicism becomes dominant, collective cohesion deteriorates. If everything is rigged, participation declines. If every institution is presumed compromised, reform becomes impossible. The delicate balance is vigilance without paranoia, inquiry without fantasy. The Epstein case remains unfinished in the public imagination, not because there are no official conclusions, but because cultural closure is different from legal closure. Legal cases end with documentation. Cultural cases end with restored trust, and trust is slower to rebuild than any verdict. Perhaps the most uncomfortable truth is that no system designed by humans will ever be perfectly transparent. There will always be complexity. There will always be confidential elements. There will always be imperfect outcomes. The challenge is not achieving perfection. It is maintaining credibility despite imperfection. So what remains? Not simply a scandal, but a mirror reflecting modern anxieties about concentrated influence, about elite insulation, about information overload, about the fragility of shared reality. And maybe the most important question of all is not, what exactly happened behind every closed door, but rather, what must institutions do to preserve legitimacy in an era where trust is evaporating? Because when trust collapses, systems weaken. And when systems weaken, polarization fills the gap. The Epstein case, in that sense, is less about one man and more about the architecture of power in the 21st century, an architecture built not only on laws and titles, but on perception, on networks, on narratives, on belief, and belief, once fractured, is the hardest thing to restore. But let's go deeper. Power in the modern world is rarely centralized in a single visible throne. It is distributed, layered, networked. Financial systems intersect with political systems. Political systems intersect with academic institutions. Academic institutions intersect with philanthropic foundations. Philanthropic foundations intersect with think tanks. Think tanks influence policy conversations. Policy conversations influence legislation. Legislation influences markets. Markets influence political campaigns. This is not conspiracy. It is complexity. Modern power is systemic. And systemic power is harder to trace than hierarchical power. In medieval times, power had a face, a king, a queen, a ruler. Today, power often looks like a web, and webs are difficult to map in real time. When someone like Epstein appears within multiple elite circles, the public reaction is not only about that individual, it is about the web. It raises a deeper discomfort. How interconnected are the upper layers of society? And if they are interconnected, who oversees the overseers? Democracies rely on checks and balances, but checks and balances are designed for formal institutions. Congress checks the executive. Courts check legislation. Regulatory agencies check corporations. But who checks social influence? Who regulates private proximity? Who audits reputation networks? There is no constitutional clause for dinner invitations. There is no regulatory body for elite introductions. And yet introductions can shift trajectories of power. This is where public imagination begins to stretch. not necessarily because there is proof of coordinated wrongdoing, but because the structure itself feels opaque. Opacity does not automatically mean corruption, but opacity in environments of high power creates discomfort, and discomfort seeks explanation. Let's examine another dimension: incentive structures. Most systems reward success. Financial success brings prestige. Prestige brings access. Access brings opportunity. Opportunity brings more success. It is a feedback loop. But feedback loops, when unregulated, can amplify imbalance. If certain individuals accumulate extraordinary levels of access without equivalent scrutiny, public perception may interpret that imbalance as favoritism, even if no explicit favoritism exists. Perception matters, because perception shapes legitimacy, and legitimacy is not purely legal. It is psychological. When citizens believe that institutions operate fairly, they comply more willingly. When they believe fairness is compromised, compliance becomes reluctant. Eventually, reluctant compliance turns into resistance. That is why trust is not optional. It is foundational. Another element that intensified the Epstein narrative was scale. The case involved powerful names, high-profile associations, global attention. The more visible the circle, the more intense the scrutiny. And scrutiny in the digital era does not unfold slowly. It unfolds in waves. A document release triggers speculation. A witness statement triggers commentary. A court filing triggers viral threads. The speed of reaction often exceeds the speed of verification. And when verification lags, suspicion fills the silence. Silence is interpreted as concealment, but silence can also be legal limitation. Ongoing investigations restrict communication. Confidentiality laws restrict disclosure. Privacy rights restrict publication. Yet the public rarely differentiates between legal silence and strategic silence. Both feel the same from the outside. Another uncomfortable truth is this: complex cases rarely provide cinematic endings. Real life is bureaucratic, messy, procedural, uncertain, but public expectation is shaped by storytelling. Stories demand closure, villains punished, truth revealed, mystery solved. When reality does not provide narrative satisfaction, people construct alternative narratives, not always maliciously, often psychologically. The brain craves coherence. When coherence is missing, imagination supplies it. Now, consider the digital amplification factor. Algorithms prioritize engagement. Engagement often correlates with emotional intensity. Emotionally charged interpretations travel farther than cautious analysis. Measured skepticism does not trend as easily as explosive certainty. As a result, moderate voices can be drowned out. Nuance becomes background noise. And in that environment, complexity loses to simplicity. Simple explanations feel powerful, but they are rarely complete. Let's widen the lens even further. The Epstein case unfolded during a period of global instability, rising inequality, political polarization, declining trust in media, declining trust in government. When a scandal involving elites emerges in such a climate, it does not land on neutral ground. It lands on dry wood, and dry wood ignites easily. In another era, perhaps the reaction would have been different, but context matters. Historical timing matters. Cultural mood matters. There is also the philosophical dimension of secrecy. Not all secrecy is sinister. Diplomatic negotiations require confidentiality. Corporate strategy requires discretion. Legal defense requires privacy. But secrecy becomes problematic when it intersects with accountability. If confidentiality prevents necessary oversight, then it undermines legitimacy. The tension between transparency and functionality is permanent. Too much transparency can paralyze decision-making. Too little transparency erodes trust. Modern societies are still negotiating that balance. Perhaps that is the deeper lesson here. The Epstein case did not just expose a criminal proceeding. It exposed a fragile interface between elite networks and democratic expectation. Democracy assumes equal application of law. Elite networks operate on unequal access by design. When those two realities collide, tension is inevitable. The public does not demand that influential people have no relationships. That would be unrealistic. But the public does demand that relationships do not override accountability. When accountability appears uncertain, doubt spreads, and doubt, once widespread, reshapes political behavior. It fuels outsider movements. It strengthens anti-establishment rhetoric. It amplifies calls for systemic overhaul, sometimes constructive, sometimes destabilizing. The real danger is not skepticism. It is total disillusionment. Because when people conclude that institutions are irredeemably corrupt, they stop seeking reform within the system. They begin seeking rupture outside it. History shows that rupture is rarely controlled. It is often chaotic. So perhaps the central reflection is not about secrets, not about hidden lists, not about whisper meetings, but about resilience. Can modern institutions adapt to an age where every inconsistency is magnified? Can they communicate with enough clarity to prevent suspicion from metastasizing? Can they rebuild trust after high-profile failures? And can citizens maintain intellectual discipline in an environment engineered for emotional reaction? These are harder questions than any headline, but they're more important because cases come and go, symbols evolve, names fade or transform, but the architecture of power remains. And if we do not understand that architecture, if we reduce everything to personalities, we miss the structural lesson entirely. The Epstein case, at its core, forces society to confront something uncomfortable. Power does not always look the way we expect. It is not always loud. It is not always official. Sometimes it is quiet, connected, social, relational, and when relational power intersects with alleged criminality, the shock reverberates beyond the courtroom. It shakes confidence in the invisible networks that shape the visible world. That is why this story persists. Not because every detail is unknown, but because the underlying questions remain unresolved. About influence, about fairness, about proximity, about oversight, about the limits of transparency, and about whether modern democracies can sustain legitimacy in a world where perception spreads faster than proof. The final reflection is not dramatic. It is sober. No system is perfect. No institution is immune to failure. No network is free from human weakness. But the measure of society is not whether failure occurs. It is how transparently and effectively it responds when it does. If accountability is visible, trust can recover. If accountability feels selective, distrust deepens. The Epstein case sits at that crossroads, between exposure and uncertainty, between investigation and imagination, between skepticism and cynicism, and perhaps the most important responsibility for institutions, for media, and for citizens is this: to pursue truth rigorously, to resist premature conclusions, to demand accountability without abandoning reason, because once reason collapses, narratives replace evidence. And when narratives replace evidence, power becomes whatever people believe it to be. And belief, more than wealth, more than access, more than status, is the most powerful force of all.